Dr. Gavin Dunn. Gavin is chair for the Future Home Standard. He's the chief executive of CABE, and he recently chaired the Part L review and is chair of the Future Home Standards Working Group. So it's my pleasure to welcome Gavin to the stage.
Thank you, Martin. Hopefully my voice is going to hold up. It's my third day out and about talking to people. So we'll see how it goes. So as Martin said, I'm Dr. Gavin Dunn, I'm Chief Executive of CABE. And in particular today, I'll be talking to you from a regulatory and standards point of view, because irrespective of what we all build and procure, and I genuinely believe, so there goes, my voice is going already, that's not a good start, is it? I genuinely believe that procurement is the single way that we can genuinely change and revolutionise the industry. If you think about our procurement contracts in this sector, if a client specifies something, it rolls down the entire supply chain. If you specify a particular product, or from my perspective, a particular standard, everyone falls in line. All of a sudden, the client wants it. It is valued. It's not something we're doing because someone made us do it. It becomes something new. So procurement contracts, the way we specify, genuinely have the chance to change things. And from my point of view, there's a real opportunity at the moment to use that approach to get away from, and I'll say it, the culture of our sector at the moment is all too driven by the lowest capital cost, minimum requirements, designing for compliance, all the things that aren't going to get us where it needs to do. The regulatory requirement, the stuff I spend a huge amount of my time doing, even with things like the Future Home Standard and the current changes to Part L and F, these are the minimum acceptable standards. Right? So if you're designing and specifying to meet the minimum, odds are most of the time we won't even get that, and the evidence shows that. So I want to reframe the conversation a little bit, not about lowest capital cost, not about meeting the minimum, but think of it as regulatory standards being the baseline, but then standards. And in this country, in the construction sector, globally, we are great at producing voluntary standards above regulatory. So think about above regulatory standards, minimum compliance. If we can start thinking about using those standards, absolutely we have to talk about and meet the minimum requirements, and government will continue to push and nudge up the minimum. They might actually start requiring some quite strong levels of minimum. But above and beyond that, there's all these not above regulatory, voluntary standards. This sector's awash with them, whether it be several thousand from BSI, construction related, product related, performance related, management of building standards that BSI publishes, or whether it's things like BREEAM, LEED, and all of those sort of things that allow us to specify a higher level of performance across a wider range of requirements. Not just operational energy, but starting to get into those other elements. If we can change that conversation, we can start to drive things forward. So that's what I effectively do. I mean, I often jokingly refer to myself as a recovering architect, but actually these days I'm better described as a chartered building engineer. And what we do as an organisation, what I've spent the last 25 years doing, is working in that space of the applications of regulations and standards in terms of trying to improve better outcomes for the built environment. Now, from my perspective, and my particular area of specialism is about operational energy, carbon performance, and the wider environmental impacts. But increasingly, we're finding ourselves looking at all the wider impacts: social capital, social equality, inclusivity, ecology. All these things are linked, and the potential to add so much more value is huge if we can start building beyond. We all know that if you start building a little bit beyond the minimum requirements, actually the additional capital cost, if you can get someone to pay for it currently, is relatively small, and the paybacks tend to be quite hard. Now, from a business perspective, if I hear I can add value, most of us are going, oh, if I can add value, we can make more money out of that. And that starts to change business models, and I think other speakers might touch on that. So we've got a great tradition of above regulatory standards in this sector in this country, so the tools are there. Government will start to do its part by raising the minimum, and hopefully starting to incentivise some of the wider changes. And I guess that's probably the bit that you guys want me to reflect on the most in terms of that minimum baseline. Because at the moment, that's still the game in town, right? Government requires a minimum, that's what we're all working to. Hopefully that will change. In the meantime, we will continue to raise the minimum standards. So I guess the primary reason I'm here is I've just completed the Future Home Standard work, or phase 1 of the Future Home Standard work. And that's part of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, which is advisory to government on this. So this is changes to the building regulations. It is resetting the minimum standards for energy use, operational, ventilation, new requirements for overheating, and starting to integrate things like electric car charging infrastructure as well. So it's interesting, isn't it? So if you're looking at this from an environmental perspective, or people like me who have been bought into how do we change the world through a better built environment, we go, well, this is not going anywhere near far enough. If I look at this from a government perspective, or from 7 years I've spent on BRAC, this is the largest regulatory change in 30 years. It's integrated across multiple parts of the regulations. It accepts that if you change one bit of the building regulations, you have to adapt other bits. In other words, it's a very significant step in the right direction, in my opinion. In case you haven't noticed, and a lot of people still haven't, these requirements started to kick in last week, 22nd of June. The first phase of the Future Home Standard became law and became in effect. So if you are starting a new home, or if you're making your application for building regulations as of today, you will be expected to meet these new standards, which are increasingly these days called FLOSS. I don't know where it got from, but it's an acronym of F for ventilation, L for energy, O for overheating, and S. So what are those requirements doing, and where does it go next? So in very simple terms, two major changes to two parts of the building regulations. So that's in terms of a further tightening of the energy performance requirements in Part L, but equivalent to about a 31% increase on higher performance expectation in carbon terms over the 2013 standards, which of course everyone's supposedly building to, as well as further tightening of fabric expectations in terms of fabric performance, in terms of, and a very significant shift actually in terms of starting the journey of changing what energy sources and we use for heating our homes and buildings. For the last 30 odd years, the UK regulations have favoured natural gas, because post-Kyoto 92, it made sense, right? It was relatively cheap, clean, it was relatively cheap, it was very doable. So we spent 30 years encouraging everyone to put gas boilers in. If you look just over the horizon now, guess what? We're not going to be able to use gas anymore because it's not compatible with a zero carbon world. Actually, we can't afford to burn it. We're realising that actually some of it's running out, or we have to import it from places we don't want. Oh, and by the way, it's got flue gas emissions at street level, and if you're in places like London, that's starting to create air quality issues. So it starts the transition of moving to electric homes, which is where we will go be next. The other major changes in F, and that's about ventilation, and that's accepting that most homes in this country are currently not ventilated to the required minimum standards. It is not a coincidence that we have the highest rate of underlying respiratory ill health in this country and anywhere in the Western world. Our buildings are under-ventilated. So as we continue to tighten the energy requirements, we need to make sure the homes are properly ventilated. And when we go to really high performance from a fabric point of view, ventilation becomes critical to achieving not only your thermal performance, but obviously making sure there's sufficient and appropriate fresh air so that the people in the buildings are healthy. So they're starting to see the integration of fabric, very high levels of fabric performance, into mechanical services requirements as well. Much more of a whole house holistic approach. Other changes for the FLOSS regulations. Also, two entirely new parts of the regulations. Again, law last week. A requirement to assess homes for extreme overheating. So in other words, accepting climate change, accepting we're building buildings that are tighter. And from an energy point of view, we also need to make sure, yes, that they are warm and energy efficiency in winter, but we need to make sure that they're not a high likelihood of overheating in summer, to the point where they create ill health. And this is a health and safety standard, not a comfort standard. If you want comfort, you need to look at other things, but just making sure that we're not literally killing some of the most vulnerable people in our society. The numbers are scary. If you take current climate change scenarios and current build types, the evidence suggests that as many as half the homes in this country will be suffering severe overheating by 2050. And the CIBSE UCL data suggests that might result in the hastening of 4,500 deaths per year. In other words, far more people dying as a result of that, potentially, than in fires or structural failure. It just happens slowly. And then the final part of the changes we're seeing at the moment is S, and I'll come back to the theme, which is then actually a building regulatory requirement from another government department, and it's starting to accept that actually provision of electric car charging infrastructure, because everything's going electric, not just our homes, but our transport as well. So that when you're building a new home, isn't it a really good idea the house builder actually puts in an electric car charging if you've got a parking space, so that homeowners can actually get what they need. So, biggest set of changes for 30 years in the building regulations, and the first step, because this is 2020, this is 21 changes, even though they're happening in 2022. 2025, the next step again, and that will be what they're referring to, the Future Home Standard. Government will be consulting on it next year, and that will be effectively very, very high performance homes, about a 75% reduction in carbon compared to 2030 standards. More requirements on ventilation, more requirements on overheating, and in particular starting to address some of the next key challenges as well. The performance gap, ensuring there's much greater attention given to what you're actually designing is actually getting built and put forward in a way that can be used. Parliamentary Select Committee has just also suggested to government that they might wish to include things like whole house, whole life carbon assessments to start to impact the materiality and the life cycle carbon impacts of materials into those regulations as well. I think other people are going to touch on that, but it is the start of the journey. It's only the minimum regulatory requirement. But I tell you, if 2025, there's a minimum requirement from a regulatory perspective comes out and says you have to assess whole life carbon on every new building, that's a very significant step forward. And actually, far, far more progressive and far-reaching than I ever thought was possible even a few years ago. I joined BRAC in 2015. Zero carbon homes had just been scrapped. Everything else seemed to be scrapped. If you were in the energy and environmental game at that time, you thought government was abandoning the agenda. 5 years in the wilderness, and it's all coming back very, very quickly. I genuinely believe, as a sector, we have the ability to do so much better for the people that occupy buildings, but also for the climate. And by the way, I think we can build a more profitable, more valuable, and nicer industry working when we do it. But it requires everyone to actually come together. Government can do its bit, but actually so much more. And if we just do the minimum from government, we won't get there. I think that's plenty for me, and hopefully I've teed up a few other speakers. Thank you very much.